Hey class, so for this exercise we are making our bouncing ball. So the first thing we want to do is create a ground plane. In this case, we're going to make a ground cube. So I'm going to scale it up, flatten it out, and maybe make it a bit longer. So this will be the surface that our bouncing ball is going to bounce on. Now I do want to make sure that I move it down to, so the top is level with 0. So I'm going to move my pivot point. So remember, press D, and I'm actually going to move it snap to points. So D, and just pull it up a little bit. And now I'm going to turn off snap to point, turn on snap to grid, and I'm just going to move it down. So now you can see that it is level with my grid. There we go. And I'm going to put it on a layer. Create layer from selected and call this ground. And I'm going to lock it so that I can't move it. There we go. Save. So set it to reference. And that is nice and locked. And we can even rename it over to the right and call it ground. Cool. So for this exercise, we are going to be using the ball rig from High-End 3D by Yolanda. And I will link it below. You could also use the ultimate ball rig or just create a sphere. To use this rig in my scene, I don't actually want to import it. So that would be file and import, or creating a new file with that model. Instead, what I want to do is bring it in as a reference. So I'm going to go to File and Create Reference, find the model that I just downloaded, and I actually put it into a special rigs folder on my hard drive, and click Reference. Now what this does is keep the rig file as a separate file outside of this particular scene or in this particular animation. What's nice about this is there's no way for you to accidentally break the rig or the model. And you can also bring in multiple versions of this rig into your scene, so you can use different versions of it. This particular model, what we're looking at right now, is like a volleyball type model, but you can also change it to be a basketball, a bowling ball, a beach ball, etc. by clicking on this or highlighting this plus sign and clicking through the different options. You can also have just a standard ball. And by being able to bring in multiple references of this same file, you can have multiple types of balls in your scene, which we're going to do in a later exercise. So creating reference also is great if you're working in a team environment all on the same character and the modelers want to make an update to the character. Then all of the animations that reference that character can be updated at the same time. So it's referencing is the way to go when you're working with an animation. All right, so you can see when this model came in, it came in very large. So I want to change its global scale. Just a couple things about working with rigs. Generally this outside rig, kind of this ground arrow, is just for placing the model in the scene. You will not use it after this point. So I'm just going to kind of click on it and go to global scale, and I'm just going to change this to 0.1, which makes it much more reasonably sized. And then that's pretty much it. I'm not going to adjust that in the future. And then otherwise, I think we're just going to be using the positioning of this rig. So that's going to be this big control right here. And we'll be using that for all of our translate X and translate Y and Z in the scene. Okay, so now that we've got our rig in our scene, I want to talk a little bit about planning and reference. So to illustrate the physics behind the bouncing ball, I actually videotaped some reference of a few balls. So there's the basketball. And then I also did a volleyball that I had, and tennis ball, and this was a deflated kids ball, tennis ball, etc. And I brought them into Sync Sketch, and for this initial scene, I just wanted to figure out the keyframes for the basketball, because it's a good ball to use. It's very standard. It doesn't have a lot of squash and stretch. So what I did was mark as a key all of the high points and where the ball actually hit the ground. So you can see here is 23 and 24 were basically hitting the ground. 37, 38 is the high point of the arc. Again, it hits the ground. And I just marked all of these so I could see the physics behind it. And then from there, I just used my little notes to say, okay, this animation or this ball dropping started on frame 16. It hit the ground between 23 and 24. It bounced again and was at its peak at 36. Again, it fell 49.50. And you can see that every time the ball hits the ground, it's going to lose energy. So the bounce back up is not going to be as high as the previous bounce. So, and it's going to take less frames and travel less distance. So the first bounce going up and back down again took 12 or 13 frames. The next bounce took 10 or 11. The next bounce was 9. The next bounce was 8, 6, 4, etc. So using those principles, I made my notes, and it's by making notes and planning out your animation in advance of when the frames are going to be bouncing and when they're going to be at the top of the arc, it'll make this animation a lot faster. So that's the benefit of using reference. But you can also just kind of wing it, as long as you're following the general principle that your first bounce will be your highest and take the most amount of time, and then subsequently less frames. Okay, so now back in Maya, I have my frames and my animation generally planned out. So now the first thing I can do is go to the camera that I want to use. So I'm going to go to my front camera, and I can turn on resolution gate to see exactly what my frame will look like when I render. And I just want to make sure that I have enough space for my animation. So not too far, not too close. And I can actually go to view, create camera from view, and I can call this shot camera. Actually, all caps. There we go. And I'm going to lock this shot camera. Cool. All right, so remember that I'd like to use auto key when I'm animating. It's just a habit I've gotten into. So I want to grab my, you know what, I need to unlock this and just zoom in a little more. It's a little too far back. There we go. And just grab my controller. So that's that horizontal main controller that we're going to be using for all of our translations. So I'm going to use auto key. So the very first thing I need to do is set a key for this controller on frame 1. And then I know that on frame 16, actually, frame 16, my model is, or my rig is going to be starting off camera. So let's bring it up to off camera, set that keyframe again by pressing S, and then let's start at frame 16 and also set a keyframe there, because remember, when you're holding a position, you want to have a start and end position. Okay, so I know that frame 23 or 24, I know that it's going to be my first bounce. So let's move my rig so that it's a translate Y of 0. So that means it's vertically exactly starting on the ground. And I'm going to turn on auto key. So make sure I'm on frame 23. I'm going to hit S to set my keyframe. And this is a good time to open our graph editor. So let's try using the workspace called animation. So that's going to set up our graph editor down below here. Unfortunately, it did change our camera, so we have to go back to panels and let's do orthographic and shot cam. So that's my shot camera. You can kind of zoom out a little bit. Oh, shoot. There we go. Okay, I'm going to lock that camera again. And you can see in the graph editor here, I have curves that represent my X movement. So that's my movement left to right. My Y movement, so that's my bounce up and down. And then Z, we don't need to worry about right now. Okay, so actually right now I just want to concentrate on the bounce motion. So let's just look at our translate Y. All right, so got 23 on frame 36. I'm going to be bounced back up in the air. So let's go to frame 36. Now it's going to be almost as high, but not quite as high as where it started. So just set that. Frame 49, it's going to be back down at 0, so I can just click here and go back to 0. Frame 60, we're going to be back up again. 60, 71, back down to 0. 80, back up. And each time I'm bouncing it not quite as high as before. 89, back down to 0. 97, a little higher. 105, back to 0. 111, back up. 117, back down. And I guess this is going a little long. 121, just a tiny little bounce. And then 123, back down again. And then from there, I think it will just roll, and that's it. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to turn off auto key for a second, and let's just preview what happened. I'm going to press F while hovering over my graph editor, and that will show me my entire graph. So you can see right now I did a fairly decent job of making sure these keyframes are moving up and down and getting a little lower each bounce, but I can always adjust these. So you do want to hold down shift if you make any adjustments, otherwise you can move these all over the place and it'll get a little wonky. Okay, so let's hit play. And so you can see that it is very floaty right now as an animation. And that's because our tangents are just set to automatic. And the bottom of these bounces have eases in them. So that's the first thing we're going to take care of. We want to grab all of these plus this end one. And we want to go to split tangents or break tangents. And it looks like a little V in the middle here. I'm just going to click break tangents. And now I can make adjustments by clicking on here, drag selecting the handle, and making this look a little bit more like a V shape. So I'll just fast forward the video while I make those adjustments. And I find these little anchor points a little bit of a pain in the butt to grab sometimes. So the key is you click on the anchor point, drag and select the handle next to it, and then move it up. And you want your curves to be kind of nice and sharp at the bottom, and then having a nice slow arc at the top. Sometimes it's easier than others to grab these. You can see I'm struggling to grab the handle there. And that's why I made this graph editor a bit bigger as well. So I want you to make sure that all of your bounces and your arcs are looking like this. And you can see this one keyframe is not in the center, so I'm going to just drag to select it, and then you can middle mouse button move it over. All right, and now I'm going to put this back where it came from, hopefully. There we go. And now you can hit play to see what this animation is looking like. All right, so now when I hit play, it's looking pretty good. It definitely has slower timing or spacing at the top of the curves, and it has more of a sharp bounce. It's not floating anymore. Now there's a few things I could do to give this more of a float at the top. So to make these curves a little more flat at the top, hit F, there we go. So we haven't talked about this yet, but there is a thing called weighted tangents. And basically what it means is that you can change the length of these handles to make them, to make this curve flatter at the top and sharper at the bottom. So that's one way of doing that. So let me just show you that. So go to tangents, actually curves and weighted tangents, and see how it changes the length of these handles. Actually, it changed all of them. Okay. So what I would do then is grab this handle and I can drag it out, and this will give it more of a slower top, so more spacing at the top. And you can grab multiple ones of these at the same time. Just kind of make sure that you're keeping them nice and flat at the top. And if you have to flatten them out, let's see. Let's try that one more time. So I did flat, and then I'm just going to be really careful on making these nice and flat. Okay. And this guy and this one. Let's do the same thing. I'm going to flatten these. So Alt and middle mouse button does work for these guys. And there's something a little funky about this one. There we go. Okay, so now you can see it's much flatter and wider at the top. Now if I hit play, you can see it's got a lot more hover on the upswing. Now finally, there's one other way I could have done this. And that instead of using the weighted tangents, I could just add a key here. So if I go to this frame and set a key, so that's 58, so 62, set a key, and then adjust these pieces here. So that would also give me a very similar effect. Depending on the production line that you're working with, if you're working with multiple people, you may want to use this method because you can use non-weighted tangents that way. But for right now, I'm just going to keep these. Okay, so next part is we are going to, and please adjust these as you will for, you know, use your artistic judgment and your animator's judgment to adjust these curves so that they look correct in your eye for the bouncing ball that you're going for. So these curves and the height of them, the flatness of them, will change depending on the type of ball that you're using and its weight. Okay, so I want to work on my forward motion. So you can see that I have translate X is going to determine the forward and back movement of this ball. If you're in the side view, it may be your translate Z. You really want to make sure auto key is turned off because we're only going to be setting keys for this translate X. Okay, and what I have right now is that the ball is staying off camera, and then around frame 8 it starts to move forward. By 16 it's in view and it's heading down for its first bounce. And then from there, it's just staying in place. So these keys on the right here, I can get rid of. And basically I want by, let's see, the time that it's at 115, I want it more or less in the, close to the final place where it's going to be. So I'm going to move it to the right here. I'm going to right click on the translate X and just key selected. Now that sets a key only in this value rather than pressing S that will set keys everywhere. So now you can see I have a little bit of ease right here, so I'm going to fix that. There we go. And let's hit play just to see what that's looking like. So it's falling. It definitely has a bit of float to it. That's okay. Cool. So now once it gets to the end here, to 117, I do still want it to move ahead. And so let's go to 123. I want it to be hit here. Key selected. And then I actually, for like frame 125, I do want it to move backwards a tiny bit. So just like it's bouncing forward and then bouncing back. So I'm just going to key select it on that one. Let's see how that looks. So that's called an overshoot. There we go. And now that's kind of a little harsh. So I do want it to roll a tiny bit as well. So I'm going to cut that. Keep that one. Maybe 130 instead. I'm going to bring it forward. Key selected. And then 133. This time, let's move it back just a hint. Key selected. All right, let's take a look. Definitely, I'm going to change some of my hovers. Now, it does seem to be doing quite a big jump at the end. So instead of that last bounce, I'm going to change this last bounce to just a flat. So I'm going to select these two keys and let's make them flat. There we go. So that will get rid of that bounce and it'll just roll at the end. All right, and I think it's rolling a tiny bit too much. It probably wouldn't do that much roll. Okay, so let's grab these guys, these three. I'm also going to make them flat and just drag them down a little bit. There you go. Okay. Last thing I'm going to do is add a little rotation. Because this is a basketball, it should be rotating as it's moving. And I want to rotate it this way, so rotate Z. So to set a key for that, I'm going to start it there by frame 135. I want a rotate Z of, let's say, 720. And just key selected. And I don't think we need these middle keys, so I'm just going to select and delete them. And let's take a look. Okay, now see it's rotating the wrong way. So we want to change the key for the end of this. So if you ever can't see your keys, just press F. So this will be negative 720. Hit play. Nope, still rotating the wrong way. Oh, negative 720. And I want a key selected. Sorry. Key selected. Okay, now when we hit play, there you go. Now I need to fix that slide at the end there. So that's in my Translate X. Okay, so I want to fix this slide at the end. So it's here, and then these three keys need to be over more. Over and actually down. There we go. So they don't go as far. Okay. And then these, I don't think they need to be. They look. There we go. I'm just going to spline them. Move them just a tiny bit. There we go. So once this hits, I'm also going to set a key in my rotation. Because I want this to rotate a bit faster than what it's doing. And also when it rotates forward to here, we need to set a key on this rotation. Key selected. And I'm going to make this maybe -740. And then when it goes backwards, it's going to need to rotate backwards. So then it'll be -720. So it's just going to rotate forward, maybe even more. Oh, you know what? I never set the key. 740. Key selected. And then by the time it rolls back, it's going to be at -720. So let's take a look at that. Boom, 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 boom. There we go. And I could add a little more back and forth with this rotation. Let's do that. Sorry, these are the nitty-gritty things that take a little extra time. So let's do 750. And I'm going to do -715 just so it doesn't end up straight up and down here. -755. Right click, key selected, go to this forward one. And this one will be, how about -710. Right click, key selected. So now it is rolling and then rotating backwards again. There you go. And that could definitely use some refinement, but this video is long enough. So let's just talk about play blasting. So we've done play blasting before, but in this case, I do want to set our scene a little better. So one thing when you're play blasting, I want you to go to show and turn off your NURBS curves. So you're not looking at those curves. I also want you to make sure that you don't have, you know, any of these transforms on. So we're not looking at the control for the move, scale, or rotate tool. Next, let's just add a little bit of lighting to our scene. So I'm going to go to my perspective view real quick. For the grounds, I'm going to make this selectable. Object mode. Let's right click and assign a new material. I'm going to choose a Lambert. And this Lambert, let's make it a nice color. So blue, but then I'm just going to scale back the saturation and value a little bit so it's not sticking out, not drawing attention from the ball. Okay. I'm also going to add a back plane. So let's go to my poly modeling. Let's scale this one up, rotate it this way. So I'm going to hold down J, click and drag to rotate it 90 degrees. Let's move it back. Somewhere around here. And then right click, assign existing material, and let's do that Lambert 2. Okay, so now let's go back to our camera. So that's under orthographics and shot cam. We can hide our grid. Okay, and because these two colors are running into each other, I'm just going to assign a new material to the backdrop. Let's choose a Lambert. I'm going to choose a slightly lighter color than the existing. And then just to prepare this shot, make sure that you turn off your resolution gate so that you are seeing just your window. You can check your render settings. I'd like for size to be HD 1080. And then we want to make sure we're not looking at our controls. So let's do show and turn off your NURBS curves. So that hides those controls. Make sure you have your select tool active, and then let's go to select and deselect all. So now that's a nice preview. A couple more settings. We can turn on shadows in this scene. We can turn on screen space ambient occlusion and also multi-sample anti-aliasing. So these three little icons. It just improves the quality the tiniest bit. Okay, now we're ready to play blast. So let's right click, play blast, and the option box. Format AV foundation, encoding H.264, display size from render settings, and I'm saving to a movie file, so save to file on my desktop. Hit play blast. Depending on the power of your computer, this may take a minute or two. I've also been getting a weird pop-up box saying that it can't save my file as a QuickTime, but once I close that, it's generally, yeah, this little message. Just hit OK. It's still there, and it's still saving. So that's your bouncing ball. So please turn that in, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.